certamente il progetto sull'energia, insomma, appunto, su una città così sostenibile, in linea con appunto quello che dicono tutti i grandi esperti, Rifkin in primis, che la nuova frontiera sarà l'energy divide nel mondo, cioè chi potrà oggi dotarsi di case che hanno un sistema energetico intelligente, domani saranno quelli che non saranno appesi al cappio dell'energia, della dipendenza energetica, quindi è un punto crucialissimo. Ecco, su questo fronte, sulle divisioni e le disuguaglianze fra ricchi e poveri, vorrei chiamare in causa Imoni Akpofure, che è la Special Representative per l'Europa dell'International Finance Corporation, che è una delle 5 istituzioni che fa capo alla World Bank e che si occupa del tema dello sviluppo e della lotta alla povertà. Abbiamo già parlato di questi temi stamattina, di come combattere le grandi disuguaglianze nel mondo, e abbiamo visto che ci sono una serie di problemi aperti, anche di competenze molteplici, che fanno sì che poi non si capisca mai bene qual è il livello vero delle decisioni su alcuni grandi temi, l'abbiamo detto stamattina più volte. Quindi io le domande che vorrei fare a Mrs. Akpofure sono di fatto due. Da una parte come le grandi istituzioni internazionali possano riaffermare davvero la capacità di prendere decisioni che poi vengano condivise anche dai vari paesi, e quindi poi non ci sia sempre un passo indietro rispetto alle grandi scelte e alle grandi decisioni che vengono affermate nelle sedi internazionali, e quindi chi ha davvero il pallino in mano in qualche modo, e dall'altra parte se la green economy, abbiamo detto anche stamattina, può essere davvero una risposta, o se invece, perché per il momento la green economy è supportata da enormi, cospicui investimenti pubblici, cioè la green economy sarà in grado ben presto di diventare una risposta che cammina sulle sue gambe, o avrà sempre bisogno di essere accompagnata da grandi politiche di finanziamento pubblico? Questi sono i due temi su cui vorrei brevemente sentirla.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here. It's actually been a very interesting morning and afternoon for me. I will start off just by giving some information to answer a question about, I think there was a question this morning on the development within the European Union and the other Europe. And I just wanted to note some figures. Within the totality of the European Union and also within Central and Eastern Europe, the countries that are not yet part of the EU, there are two primary institutions of the European Union, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and more importantly, the European Investment Bank. The EBRD last year provided 7.9 billion euros for financing of projects in Central and Eastern Europe. That's very significant. The European Investment Bank provided 79 billion euros for projects within the European Union and also within the European Union accession countries, well, globally. And 70 billion was within EU and EU enlargement. 1.2 was in Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific. So I guess this is just a reassurance, I can't see the gentleman, that there are international financial institutions which are focusing on development within the European Union and the EU enlargement area. Okay, so to your actual two questions. I think I'm going to come at it very much from a private sector development perspective. There was a question of aid versus trade. And really look at saying, well, how can international financial institutions really help alleviate poverty and bring buy-in from states, both the states in which we have poverty, but also the more developed world? I think when you look at what happened during the financial crisis, global private sector flows were about $1.7 trillion in 2007. Last year, there were about 454 billion. In the developing world, it's estimated to be about $210 billion in the developing world, this global private sector flows. So you definitely need to have some public sector money. We, as the private sector arm of the World Bank Group, we firmly believe that you can't only have public sector money lead to growth. And so if you're going to focus on alleviating poverty, you have to have a combination of public sector money, but you really need to grow the private sectors in emerging markets. And so during the crisis, one of the things that a lot of the international financial institutions did was pool together to pool their resources to be able to provide money that would go to continue growing the economies. Again, in Central and Eastern Europe, you had a combination of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, EIB, and the World Bank Group, who came together to pledge $24.5 billion to make sure that banks in Central and Eastern Europe continued to lend, and continued to lend primarily to the SMEs. The way that we talked earlier on today about the need for countries to sort of give up their sovereignty. And the benefits of having multilateral development banks and international financial institutions is that countries are our shareholders. So in that sense, they have a say in our development policies. As I said, I'm focusing on emerging markets. So we are looking and saying, the countries are saying, how can we make sure that these multilateral development banks are continuing to lend and to assist emerging markets to grow? We look very much, another role that we play is to promote models, and I'll feed this into your question on green technology. 20 years ago, something called the Global Environment Facility was started. Again, this was primarily public sector money, but there was a very clear private sector window. And in its 18 years of operations, the GEF has lent about $8.7 billion through grants, but also a combination of co-financing. We operate the private sector window. We started off very much seeing that you needed a lot of public sector money because you had some technologies that were unproven, you had some technologies that were proven. And for the proven technologies, you needed to grow the markets. In 18 years, as most of you know, you have now got a very clear market for things like wind energy. We recently financed a project in Bulgaria that was about 280 megawatt wind farm. This would have been unheard of even 10 years ago. So we're seeing more and more that the public sector subsidy part of the green technologies is no longer needed to the extent that it was. And the private sector now has a market and it's able to come in and finance it, especially in emerging markets. This led a few years ago to the creation of something called the Climate Investment Funds, which again was a group of multilateral development banks, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, EBRD, EIB, the World Bank Group, who came together primarily to say, let's create two windows. One that looks at technology, and let's fund technology, public, private, and then one that looks at climate adaptation. Let's look at technologies that help emerging markets adapt. So this is very proactively saying we want to move this debate and the financing for this very much more into the private sector side in emerging markets, and let's assist it with the public sector, but with a very clear exit. A third role that I just talk about briefly is what I call a catalytic role, because the way that you try and move is by getting people to convene. One of the benefits of being a multilateral development bank is that you can pull people together. So in 2003, 10 commercial banks got together to adopt what were then IFC's environmental and social policies in something called the Equator Principles. And they basically said that they would use IFC's environmental and social standards in all their project financing.